These are the last known moments of Haruka Weiser after dance class at the University of Texas. She told a friend she was on her way home, then vanished. So what happened on that short walk across campus that night? What makes this story so heavy is not that it began with something obviously wrong. On the contrary, it began like a very ordinary evening. On the night of April 3rd, 2016, Haruka Weiser left dance class at the University of Texas just like she had on so many other days. She was only 18 years old, a freshman, and already pursuing a future that seemed very clear. Haruka loved the performing arts and was deeply committed to dance, but she was also serious about the academic path ahead of her. At that point, her life moved in familiar rhythms, going to class, practicing, seeing friends, and returning to her residence after a long day. That night began in exactly that same rhythm. Before heading back, Haruka texted a friend to say she was on her way home. It was a completely ordinary update, a small detail that no one at the time could have imagined would become the final marker in the entire case. There was no clear warning, no sign that the night would end any differently, just a student leaving class and heading home, the way so many students do every evening. But by the next morning, Haruka did not show up to class. She also did not answer anyone. To the people who knew her, that immediately felt unusual. Haruka was not the kind of person who would simply disappear from her normal routine without saying anything. That is why her silence quickly made friends and professors realize something was wrong. A missing person report was filed, and the search began immediately on campus. Police and those around her focused on the places Haruka may have passed through the night before, especially the route from class back to her residence. That walk was not long. It was a familiar path on campus, close enough that people would naturally assume it was safe. But as investigators began reconstructing her final movements, they discovered that part of that route was covered by security cameras. And that was where one detail began to emerge. During the time window when Haruka passed through that area, the cameras captured a teenage boy with a red or pink bicycle carrying a bag, lingering in the area longer than normal. At first, it was simply an image worth noting, but then another moment made that detail far more important. When Haruka passed by, he was still there, watching, and then began moving in the same direction. There was no loud noise, no visible chaos, just a very small shift in movement on a campus that had already grown quieter after dark. But small changes like that can become the turning point of an entire investigation. From there, the case was no longer a completely open-ended missing person situation. It began narrowing to a very short window of time, a very specific route, and one person appearing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. The bicycle, the bag, the direction of movement. Those details would later become the backbone of the entire case file. As time passed, with no news, the search continued to expand across campus. Then it led investigators to the area around Waller Creek, behind the alumni building. That was where the case changed completely. Haruka's body was found at the edge of the water, wedged between two large rocks and covered with branches and debris. From that moment on, this was no longer a missing person case. It had become a homicide investigation. The scene showed that after the attack, the killer had also tried to conceal her body using whatever was available nearby. That mattered because it showed the behavior did not end at the moment of the assault. It continued afterward. Investigators began collecting evidence around the area while also trying to reconstruct where Haruka may have been approached, how she ended up in that location, and which direction the killer had taken when leaving the scene. News that a student had been murdered on campus changed the atmosphere immediately. The sense of safety disappeared almost overnight. Students were urged to walk in groups, be more careful at night, and everyone understood that the person responsible still had not been identified. After the scene was discovered, investigators returned to the one thing that mattered most at that stage: the timeline. They reviewed the surveillance footage from Haruka's route that night, and in those images, the teenage boy with the red or pink bicycle began to stand out much more clearly. At first, he was simply someone who needed to be identified. But then, another detail pushed the investigation forward even faster. Some of Haruka's friends believed the bag seen in the footage looked very much like one of hers. At that point, the camera was no longer just showing a stranger passing through. It was beginning to create a direct link to Haruka. The real turning point came from somewhere very few people would have expected: the Austin Fire Department. Around the same time, firefighters had responded to a fire at a place where a homeless teenage boy had been staying. When they later looked at the surveillance images released from campus, they recognized the person in the footage as someone they had already encountered during that fire response. That information immediately pulled the investigation in a new direction. When detectives returned to the fire location, they found several more important details: a red bicycle, personal belongings, burned school materials, and items that could be connected to Haruka. When placed alongside the footage from campus, those scattered pieces began to form a much more coherent chain than investigators had before. This case was not unlocked by a confession or a direct eyewitness. It was unlocked by a very small chain of recognition, beginning with a red bicycle appearing in the right place at the right time and leading investigators to the person they were looking for. The person who gradually became the center of the investigation was Mikhail Khalil Kreiner, who was 17 years old at the time Haruka was killed. As investigators followed the chain of evidence, they found additional items linking him to Haruka, most notably a MacBook with a Portland sticker and belongings believed to belong to her. From that point on, suspicion no longer rested only on his appearance on camera or his presence near the scene. It began turning into a much clearer prosecutorial case. But right then, the case ran into a major obstacle. The police forensic lab fell into crisis. Multiple DNA samples were delayed, and part of the evidence no longer retained the value it was originally expected to have. That was a serious problem, because in a case like this, DNA should have been one of the strongest pillars of the prosecution. Once that pillar weakened, the case had to rely far more heavily on what remained. And what remained was what kept the case from collapsing. There was footage placing Kreiner on Haruka's route during the critical time window. There was a chain of physical evidence connecting the campus to the place where he had been staying. And most importantly, there was a pair of prescription glasses found near where Haruka was discovered. That detail was especially powerful because it did not just place Kreiner in the area. It also made an innocent explanation much harder to sustain. By the time the case reached trial, the issue was no longer whether there was one single piece of perfect evidence. The issue was the full chain of evidence when viewed together: the camera, the bicycle, the bag, Haruka's belongings, the glasses, along with the actions that followed the crime. This case did not hold because of one flawless piece of evidence. It held because of multiple pieces, each of which might not have been enough on its own, but together formed a picture that was very difficult to separate. And that is why, even though the legal process was delayed, the case still made it to trial. Not because everything went smoothly, but because what remained was still strong enough to bring the central question before the court. Was that chain of evidence enough to prove who had been with Haruka during the final stretch of her walk that night? In 2018, after a long legal process, Mikhail Khalil Kreiner was convicted in the killing of Haruka Weiser and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term before he would become eligible for parole. Legally, that was the end point of the case. But on a human level, this is the part that leaves behind the most questions. Haruka's family had to endure the entire process knowing that what they were waiting for was not her return, but a sentence. The campus where she had studied was never the same afterward. Following the case, the university invested more in lighting, cameras, and patrols as a way of trying to repair the gaps this case had exposed so clearly. What keeps this case alive in people's minds years later is not just the sentence. It is also the sense that there had been warning signs long before, yet nothing strong enough to stop what happened in time. Haruka was simply walking home after class, a short distance, at a very ordinary hour. And yet that brief stretch of time became the final line between a normal day and a case that changed her family, that campus, and the way people think about even the most familiar walks. The Haruka Weiser case did not just leave behind a sentence. It also left behind a larger question about safety. about the small details people overlook, and about the cost of failures that only become visible after it is already too late. Looking back at this case is not about stirring outrage. It is about understanding how a very short walk, a very familiar hour, and a chain of details that initially seemed disconnected can lead to irreversible consequences. As always, all individuals mentioned in this video are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Thank you for watching. Please stay safe, stay cautious even in the most familiar situations, and I will see you in the next video.